Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering this book, The Grim Company. I picked this up last year while I was getting ready for my first tattoo. I saw it on the shelves and thought it looks like an interesting cover. Let's see. The illustration is by Gene Mullica. This is a book by Luke Skull, a name I do not recall ever seeing before, but is a pretty cool name with a C instead of a K. This book is about a dozen years old. It's from 2013. This one says First Rock Printing September 2013. And the receipt in the front that is still in here says that I paid, just this one I used $3.49 of credit, so the actual total I paid was $3.49 for this book, September 4th, 2024, 11:44 a.m., right before I got this tattoo, which I think I've showed before, is the D&D 4E ampersand with a New Mexico Zia symbol attached. So that being said, though I can recall when and where I purchased this book and the context of picking it up, Coaz is right down the street from the place I got my tattoo. I can't say I remember as much about this book. I don't mean that I read it a long time ago and haven't really reread it. I read this book about a month or two ago, and I just wasn't impressed by it. There wasn't much going on. It was trying to be this kind of dark fantasy setting, but it also involved easily the most unlikable character I've ever seen. And that was kind of intentionally set up. So, in this setting, the gods are dead and were killed by incredibly powerful mages, which honestly calls to question whether they should have ever been called gods in the first place if they can be killed by powerful mortals. They were effectively killed, but a lot of them are still very slowly dying and have mortal wounds that can't be healed. And one example they give of that is, I want to say it's called like the Wailing Rift. Oh yeah, here it is. On the map it's called the Wailing Rift. And what the Wailing Rift is, it's this chasm in the ground where a god fell when he died. And the god is still partially alive, but mostly dead, and occasionally it screams in pain as it is dying, and that scream is what gives the chasm that name, the Wailing Rift. And as far as that goes, it is an interesting setting detail, that the gods can be killed, they can be stripped of their power, but because they're such powerful beings, they don't really die immediately, they take a while to die. In this setting, it's been hundreds of years since the wizards killed those gods, and those wizards are now immortal and using the gods' old power to sustain their life. And one thing that is emphasized in this book, in the main nation ruled by one of these archmages, is that magic items, magic weapons have to be kind of bonded with a individual. So one of the antagonists, the captain of the guard, who is incredibly loyal to this archmage, is someone whose heart was damaged in a fight and was given a prosthetic heart. And so long as that archmage is alive, the magic is going to be sustained, and so he will live as long as he will live to be able to die of old age rather than dying young. And other characters have like boots that resist being moved. They are good at, like, they can use those boots for jumping really high, armbands that give them great strength. These kinds of magic items with effects that normally you see in tabletop role-playing games, fantasy tabletop role-playing games, as standard magic items are specifically bonded to that person. And those bonds can be stripped. And the Archmage can strip the magic from those individuals to gain some magic power back, because magic power takes an incredibly long time to kind of pool back up. So casters have this pool of magic, and the older they get, the longer it takes to get back to full. So the setting is this one where a young kid is part of a rebellious organization trying to fight against the Archmage. And he has been raised by this merchant believing that he is the son of a hero and that his weapon can only be used by his bloodline, and that this weapon is capable of killing magic users and is capable of breaking spells and the bonds that tie those spells to a person. And because he's been raised this way, he's kind of obnoxious in that he refuses to really take any instruction. He refuses to hear out anyone who is saying anything that he doesn't like, because he's the son of a hero. He has this heirloom weapon. He's going to be a hero someday. But he's kind of an ass as a kid. And so he ends up getting imprisoned by the Archmage and assigned to a attempt to mine magic from the remains of one of these gods, a god that died in the ocean. And specifically, he gets caught because an alchemist that worked with his patron's organization was able to develop a soporific that could cloud a person's mind from the agents of the Archmage. And the agent of the Archmage recognizes that they can't read this person's mind and singles him out specifically because of that inability to read their mind. So it's an interesting setup. There's a lot of magic flying around. Each of the Archmages is horrifically evil. The story opens up with one of the Archmages using their magic to basically drop a lake's worth of water on a city all at once, thus killing all of the people in that city at the same time, from the water pressure, from drowning, from whatever. And the news of that horrific event is trickling into the main character's city, and then a few days later into the narrative, some of the bodies start washing up because, of course, the currents are going to carry off hundreds of thousands of bodies, and those hundreds of thousands of bodies are going to disperse all over the place. So it does do a good job of emphasizing these casters are evil. It does do a good job of emphasizing these casters need to be gotten rid of, that these Archmages are creating problems for themselves and then bickering and fighting amongst each other. And, like, each of these Archmages has their own powers, very unique kinds of powers. They have their own champions. They have their own empowered champions, basically. And each one is playing their own agenda. But as the story goes on, it's obvious that some of their problems are problems that the gods were taking care of, and that without those gods, now they have to take care of those problems, but they aren't as powerful as the gods. Like, they were capable of killing the gods, but there were hundreds of these archmages at one point in time, and very few of them survived, and now there's only a handful of them alive in this part of the world, and there might be more way off into the distance, but it took hundreds of people to kill the gods, and now there are a lot fewer of those archmages. And those that survived were the most powerful, they were the most resourceful, the craftiest, the maybe even most cowardly. But these archmages created problems, and now the world is dying, and they are kind of the cause of it. And so, like, it's trying to play this grimdark fantasy. It's trying to play this end of the world kind of fantasy. A book that does it a lot better is, like, it's actually up right behind me. It's not right there. Is The Black Company does an amazing job of selling how cataclysmic, how apocalyptic the current events are. This one tries to emulate that, and I think I mentioned it in one of my recent videos, that mindset of comparing fantasy to, like, fantasy writing to pictures of Japan, and how if you've got a painting or a picture of Tokyo, there's always going to be Mount Fuji in the background, and if Mount Fuji isn't there, it's almost certainly an intentional decision, and why isn't it there? And how Tolkien is kind of a fantasy monolith in the same way, that Tolkien's work is like Mount Fuji for the genre of fantasy fiction. And I feel like it wasn't the first dark fantasy, but everything I've heard, a lot of people compare the end of the world dark fantasy kind of narrative to the Black Company. And the Iron Wolves, which I wasn't a big fan of, had elements of the Black Company's narrative in it. And I can see some aspects of that in the Grim Company. But ultimately, there are certain decisions where it's incredibly predictable what's going to happen. Like, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the character, this really dumb young main character who's been raised to think of himself as a future hero, he possesses something that is a threat to the Archmages. And so he ends up being used and killed immediately after his usefulness has subsided. What is interesting is that it implies that the heirloom weapon that he has, which was not really an heirloom weapon, but kind of is at the same time. In the narrative, it turns out that the Archmage made his father a Mage Bane weapon, and his father was one of these Grand Inquisitors. And then the main character, because he is his father's son, is able to use that mage bonded item. But once the Archmage is killed in the climax, it seems like his weapon is still magical to some degree and capable of being anti-magic. So there is some kind of unexplained shenanigans going on, but as soon as he is no longer useful to anyone, he's immediately killed because he is a threat. His continued survival and ability to use that weapon is a threat to all other Archmages. And that becomes incredibly obvious as soon as the story starts picking up. As soon as he starts working with an Archmage and she keeps him alive because he is capable of using an anti-magic weapon that could hurt one of her enemies, it's like it's obvious he is going to be killed as soon as he is no longer useful. And he has almost no combat skill whatsoever at the start of the story. So when he does get training, it's obvious that he isn't being taught everything so that he could eventually be killed by this assassin that teaches him this stuff. So, like, it's incredibly predictable. It uses a lot of tropes within its subgenre of fantasy fiction. It doesn't really do a good job of setting things up for making you want to read more. And I think that's the biggest issue, is that it seeds the narrative with all these other additional problems, but then doesn't make you want to read more. So, like, it's good, and like I said, I paid what, $3.49 for it, and yeah, $3.49 is about all I'm comfortable with having paid for this book. It wasn't great. It wasn't mediocre. I'm not going to say that, but it was okay enough that I had a fun time reading it, but I don't have any interest in reading it ever again. So it is going to go back into the used book system, and that is something I could use for credit because I want to get some credit at COAS. I finally turned in a bunch of books, and there's this book and a couple others that I recently read I think I'm going to turn back in. I'll get around to ranting about those books eventually, but I can think of, like, For the Wolf is one I don't think I'm ever going to have any reason for holding on to. 5 Broken Blades I picked up as an experiment because a broken blade wasn't something I really liked, and maybe 5 broken blades, 4 more broken blades would be more entertaining. So, like, there's a couple of these stories that I just wasn't impressed by, and I am going to be putting back into the used book system pretty soon. So, yeah. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.